Degrade podcast.
Welcome to Automated. I'm your host, Mark Verbenkov, and in this weekly podcast, we will be exploring the impact of emerging technology on jobs, society, as well as us, with business and technology leaders, researchers, and independent professionals across the world. So in today's episode, we'll be looking at the agricultural industry, which is actually facing a number of different challenges. So amongst them, weeds are actually becoming more resistant to petrochemicals. Different farming practices, such as tilling, actually further degrade the growing soil and release a large amount of CO2 into the atmosphere every single year. And, as is more relevant for the podcast, there's actually a general labor shortage experienced by many farms across the world. So this week's episode looks at the agricultural industry and specifically how using robots can help contribute to solving some of these challenges that many farmers face. My guest today is Clint Brauer. He is the CEO of Greenfield Robotics. And Clint is actually a former executive from LA's technology industry who returned back to Kansas to get back into farming and learn more about how robotics can be applied to agriculture. So we'll of course look at Greenfield Robotics and what they do. So we will discuss these challenges and go into them a little bit further in today's episode, as well as farming in general, what regenerative farming is and why it is important to adopt, as well as the robots in his company, what they're being developed for, and how they are tackling a number of the problems that are listed above. Clint, thank you very much for coming onto the Automated podcast. It's been a long time scheduling it. Glad to finally have you here. I'm looking forward to talking about robotics and agriculture and everything that we have planned today. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for being patient with me on the scheduling front.
No worries, no worries. So what I do with all my guests to start off with is, try to make it a little bit more of a human podcast. So discussing a little bit about how you initially got interested in robotics and agriculture, which is kind of the two themes that we're going to be speaking about today.
Sure. Basically about 10, 11 years ago, I came back to Kansas. I've been in California for 13 years and in tech and stuff. And I eventually set my mind on, trying to get chemicals out of food, starting with agriculture, of course, and, for many reasons, for human health reasons, for wildlife reasons, and just a lot of reasons. So went down the path of doing it manually and figuring out, what was possible, what wasn't, across a lot of different types of crops, from specialty to broadacre, and arrived at a determination that if you want to do it without tilling, that a new class of machines needed to be out there. And so that's when Greenfield Robotics started.
Interesting. And maybe for the audience who's not fully aware of all the different agricultural things, why is tilling a bad thing? It's something to do with depleting nutrients in the soil, if I remember my science from back in the day.
Well, I mean, it's a fairly recent thing, right? I mean, tilling's been around forever, plowing and disking and chiseling and ripping that ground up. And it's kind of funny that the no-till movement, kind of when you first get into it, you're like, wait, what? But yeah, as it turns out, the downside of tilling is one is erosion. You destroy the soil structure. You have no residue. You get a heavy rain, and away your soil goes. So that's one. Two, when you turn that soil over, you're emitting carbon, right? So that's another downside. And then the third thing is, contrary to, I grew up, we'd say, get the ground nice and fluffy so it can soak in the rain, right?
Right.
And it's actually the opposite. When you leave roots in the ground, preferably growing, but even the ones of former cover crops or crops, then and you have that residue sitting there on top of the soil, as it turns out, when the rainfall hits the residue, it slows down. You have the gaps in the soil provided, and you can store actually quite a bit more rainwater per cubic foot. And so it's the opposite of what you would think, at least what I was taught growing up.
Okay, interesting. And I'm assuming that that's quite important as climate change continues and we have increased flooding. I have had a project a couple of years back in the work that I'm doing now that dealt with the massive amounts of flooding. I'm assuming it's the same thing in Kansas, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's boom and bust, drought and flooding. I think that we've always had cycles like that, of course. The Midwest is kind of an extreme place at times, but it does seem like they've been accentuated now.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get bigger events than we've had and bigger droughts. And my first 2 years back farming, were 2011, 2012 full time. And it was horrendously hot. It was one of the worst droughts we've ever had, and
Mm-hmm.
it was really brutal. And I thought, holy smokes, if it's like this all the time, we're in trouble.
Right, right.
And most ground is what's called dry land. It's not irrigated, so it really matters what you do with your water.
Okay, interesting. One of the things that I saw on your website was that this is, I mean, we'll talk about Greenfield Robotics in a second, but this entire, I guess, new way of thinking about how to deal with soil, deal with agriculture is part of that regenerative farming theme. This goes to a little bit about what you were saying before, but maybe to give a little bit of context for the rest of the episode. Maybe we can just touch on that if we didn't touch on it beforehand with the things that you were mentioning.
Yeah, you bet. I mean, so you want me to kind of take folks through how regenerative ag works?
Yeah, yeah. I think it sets it up nicely for the conversation that we have after.
Sure, you bet. Makes sense. And first off, I am definitely not one of the pioneers of regenerative ag. There are folks who've been working on this for 25, 30 years.
Yeah.
And the linchpin of it is the no-till stuff we described. And that basically, like I said, you don't turn the soil over. And second thing is you always try to have a growing root as often as you can. So that can be your cash crop on a broad acre setting. By broad acre, I mean the big fields you think you're going to see in the United States, huge cornfields, soybean, wheat. And you always either want that cash crop root growing and or a cover crop. And a cover crop is simply a crop you're growing for its benefit to the soil instead of harvesting for the grain. And a lot of times cover crops will have 10 different species. So you do that. That's the second thing that you do as part of it. And that helps you sort of reduce your fertilizer needs and your herbicide needs. And then the third one that is done the least is reintegrating livestock onto the cropland. Of course, livestock's running all over pastures everywhere globally. It used to be that almost all cropland had a fence, and that's because they would put animals out there and do rotation, and rotate them on and off behind or ahead of cash crops. And that changed. The little farm that we have, the family farm, all the fences are gone. And there's many reasons for that, but that is pretty typical. And so that makes it hard to do what's called rotational grazing, where you move the animals often.
Mm-hmm.
And there's tons of benefits. And that is the third kind of main thing to regenerative ag is that. And of course, the other one, which is just good farming, is crop rotation. You try not to do the same thing year after year. You should.
Right.
Crazy too.
Right. Okay. I think that's great because so where then does the company that you have now, Greenfield Robotics, fit into this? Right. What is the purpose of? I mean, we'll talk about the robots as well. But what is the purpose of this as it relates to regenerative agriculture? Because I think that connection is quite interesting.
Yeah, I think the first bots that we have, and we just call them weed bots. It's just sort of our name, and we don't even, it's not trademarked or anything. So the first problem I set out to solve was, okay, if I go no-till and I'm growing my crops and I don't want to use chemicals, right? And that's really the difference with Greenfield is we want to solve the problem without chemicals.
Yeah.
And so how do I grow a soybean crop without chemicals? Well, the first problem that I have and many farmers have is these broadleaf weeds. Pigweed is the name in this region, and they're very invasive now. And they're resistant to herbicides when they're past a foot tall. So there's actually a risk issue there with losing control of the field. And so that was my first thing. And those weeds come up. I don't, no matter what you do, you're going to see them. And so how do we solve that problem without chemicals, right? And so our first weed bot basically goes between the rows of the already growing soybeans. It could be corn, milo, but we're really focused on soybeans. And it literally, I tested it for a couple of years. It cuts the weeds off at about an inch high. And it forces them to try to grow back without really any foliage trying to grow back. And we figure we do this, 2 to 5 times a season. We've actually never had to worry about 5 times, but you never know. In farming, you never know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, 3 times is what we think. So it doesn't solve the whole herbicide problem. It doesn't solve the whole chemical problem. We are working on that as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it certainly decreases the amount and solves some major problems for farmers.
So that's the. I mean, I did read a little bit. I think you had a blog post about this pigweed, right? Herbicide resistant, grows.
Yeah.
I have a note here: 2 to 3 inches a day it can grow, which is insane.
Yeah, when it hits a point, I mean, it just takes off, and it gets to a point you can't even humanly pull it.
Right,
when it gets,
right.
3 foot tall and the ground gets hard, and the root systems are amazing. And it's a real shame we don't all just love Palmer amaranth to eat or something, because we could really grow it well. Of course, we did that, it'd probably have wheat or something as an invasive species. So
sure,
that's just farming too.
So then the main point of the robots, the weed bots as you call them, is really to just cut down and kind of maintain that level of if in this case the pigweed, to enable, or I guess I should say reduce the amount of different kind of chemicals and herbicides, etc., on the different fields. Which, I mean, I'm not a farmer. I don't necessarily have that kind of information, but I would assume that the amount of herbicides used in these large monocrops would just be tremendous, right? We're talking tons, or just an absurd amount. Maybe you can touch on that a little bit.
Excuse me. Yeah, it really is. It's growing how much you have to use, and that's the thing. When I was younger, and 20, 30 years ago, you didn't have to use so many herbicides. But because of the growing resistance, the cocktails are getting bigger and bigger, and your cost per acre is growing. And like I said, you still have ultimate risk out there. To take a spray rig out on a field that weighs, let's call it 50,000 pounds, because it's loaded with a ton of water and it's a huge rig. You can't go through mud. So you can't always get out there, and that's where you can have escapes and you run into problems. And then flat out, no spray rig is perfect, and so you're going to have escapes that you miss, and so on and so forth. And a pretty common thing is to see a field that's been sprayed, and then it looks like the weeds are dead, and then they sprout out of the head and take off again. And mare's tail is actually another one that we see here commonly, and I've had that happen many times. And so it's harder for it to do that when it's been cut about an inch off the ground.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And maybe let's talk a little bit about the weed bots themselves. So can we get an idea about the size? I'd assume they'd be quite durable if they're going through fields, bumping into, potential crops or rocks or anything like that. Maybe you could paint a visual picture for us.
Well, they weren't that durable two and a half years ago, but they're getting there now. So, they're about 3 foot long, maybe, by, of course, they've got to be less than 30 inches wide. So I think the actual chassis is about 20 some inches wide.
Okay.
They're 4-wheel drive, skid steer, electric. They're battery driven. And they basically have 2 cutting blades on the front, that's sort of a floating platform, and it runs along and cuts them within, we're trying to get within an inch of the row. So that's the goal of it. And they don't move super crazy fast. They're a small machine, right? And so, we're targeting get him 2-3 mile an hour right now. So,
okay. And
but it's more of a swarm approach, right? It's the opposite of where ag equipment's been.
Yeah.
So we deploy more of these small bots, not 1 or 2 huge ones.
Right. Yeah. And I then assume that the impact on your actual crops would be significantly less, right? Because you're not bringing out this 55,000 ton behemoth machine. You just have a number of these smaller ones. What about battery life on them? It's interesting that they're completely run by batteries. Do they have to do multiple trips for one field, for instance?
Yeah, so we figure they run up to about 8 hours on the batteries. And of course, there's variation there depending on how many weeds we're cutting and stuff like that. But it's interesting. We had an advisor who created an electric motorcycle company a long time ago, before it was easy to do it, and did very well. And I had him do back of an envelope sort of prognostication for us before we really built our first really field ready one. And he was pretty spot on. And so, but we can swap our batteries in about a minute.
Okay.
So it's really not a huge thing.
Right. Right.
Everyone always used to gravitate to that, right? When we meet them and tell them about it. And actually, as it turns out, that seems to be the least of our challenges.
Interesting. And then how about the vision system on this? How does it navigate, right? You're saying they just kind of go between the rows of the crop. So do they sometimes, chop up some of your crop, or do they mostly focus on the weed itself? Like, is there a way to distinguish the two that the robot has?
Yeah, I mean, our approach on the surface is a lot simpler than a lot I've seen out there. Since we're not spraying and we're not spot spraying, what we're not trying to do is deal with the weeds in row, right? So the idea is that you do what you're supposed to do before you plant your crop. Your crop comes up quickly, and in row you don't have that many weeds, right?
Okay.
So 95, 98% of the problem is between those rows. And so we think farmers are totally happy with that solution. Of course, someday they're going to want to have the next version, in which we are working on. But the idea was, let's get out there in fields and let's get something done. And let's solve the problem, and let's not have an eternal R&D project here. And so that said, it is a challenge to recognize rows of crops moving at a pretty good speed using machine vision, and to coordinate the fleets moving up and down those rows. And so we've used a lot of machine vision for this, which works. We also use GPS, our kind of own version of it. And then, of course, we have all sorts of electronics for sensing and stuff that we're using now as well. So it's a combination of technologies over time. So it's a pretty steep learning curve, but it started with machine vision and someone who's super capable that joined the team right off the bat.
Right. And I guess that as it's the mechanical way of removing these weeds, you don't need to separate whether it's one type of weed or another, right? As long as something's in the way, it gets trimmed or cut down.
It's getting mowed, and the thing is, like especially with soybeans, a soybean, you plant them, they come up, you'll see them in 7 to 10 days in most cases, and they can canopy within 60 days. And by canopy, meaning they come up and then they touch right in the middle of the row. Well, when you shade it, your weeds slow down.
Right.
And so you have you have several types of weeds, but broadleaf and grasses. And broadleaf are the ones we really deal with. We basically mow the grasses, but again, and there seems to be some impact on it, but to be honest, we haven't measured it, which, you would think mowing grass, there can't be any impact. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but grasses are not a big problem in soybeans, so it seems to solve the problem for them for the most part. And once they canopy after 60 days, it's done. We'll make another run through the field, possibly right towards the end of that, and then they should be good to go.
Interesting. Okay. And one thing I want to go back to, so you're talking about like fleets, like coordinating a fleet. Maybe you could just quickly say, like, how many robots are needed for, well, I guess not per acre, right? It would be how many acres can one robot do? And then
we think about how many acres can we do with roughly 10 bots with maybe a backup or two. And the target this year, and we haven't achieved it yet, but I'm optimistic we will, is about 100 acres a day with 10 bots.
Okay.
And so that is the goal. And so that's during the daylight hours and so on and so forth. But we'll see how it works out. We're obviously getting better all the time. So we've been down in Florida doing a little testing, and we're always testing in Kansas. And so it's really about how fast can those bots move at what accuracy.
Yeah.
And that's what we're constantly working on. And so part of that's your hardware and part of that's your software.
Right. They don't run at night?
Maybe.
When
we started the company, guys were like, well, maybe we should just run at night. And I said, guys, I've lost so much sleep doing what I've been doing the last 10, 11 years, middle of the night with greenhouses, chasing animals around the countryside. They got loose, not being able to have full night's sleep at all in the winters, even sometimes in the summers. And I'm like, I am not going through that with these robots until we know everything else is further developed. And so, but we'll start testing it more this year.
Fair enough. Yeah. It's interesting. Like, say like a dark warehouse, for instance, right? Like
Yeah,
that's one of the reasons that a lot of the robots are put in there, is that there's no humans needed, so you can just have these things running continuously. But I
that's
think
right.
this is completely different when you're out in the field. You're still impacted by the elements, by the weather. Yeah, I think it's quite a different situation compared to these
Yeah,
perfect
and
dark
right now
warehouses.
we have someone always edge of field monitoring these.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
and last year it was, three someones. And so I think that as long as that's going on, you have to consider that in your hours and what the situation is out there.
Hmm.
So that's, that's part of it too.
Right, right. And then, so I mean, I'm very familiar, and I think the listeners are familiar with, say, like the Amazon warehouse automated guided vehicles, right? The small little things that lift up the boxes, move them around. They coordinate perfectly. I think there was a video that went viral several years ago, right? They're not bumping into each other ever. They have kind of perfect perception of where they are with GPS and other type of sensors. How do your robots compare, right? If you have a fleet of 10 working on, say, a 100-acre parcel of land, are they ever bumping into each other? Do they know exactly what sections do they have to do? How does that work?
Yeah, they have currently they have a centralized managing system, so they know where they are relative to each other. And
Hmm.
like I said, we have someone monitoring as well. So real time, people can see what's happening in the field, both from the perspective of the bot, because we are streaming video back from
Hmm.
each bot,
Okay.
and also from the perspective of a satellite GPS view, which would show them relative to each other as well. And then, of course, there's, I'm sure Steven's coded in at this point, collision management and stuff like that.
Right.
It's not to my knowledge, on a peer-to-peer basis yet. They don't talk to each other real time in the field and coordinate. It
Hmm.
goes back
Hmm.
to a centralized system, but who knows, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
Steven's job, not mine. But
Hmm.
that's kind of how it happens. But before we ever set foot in the field, we actually scan the entire field and with a drone and digitize it back and
Mm.
load that up into the system. So there's a lot that goes on before we even step foot in the field in terms of pathing and understanding where we're going and where we're not.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a little bit similar to how the Google car was doing it, right? They're scanning the roads constantly, getting a really clear vision of what the cars are going to be going into, and then have the system on board navigate both the digital map, the pre-rendered map, as well as the kind of real time vision that they're seeing with lidar
I
and
actually didn't
others.
realize that. That's really cool. That makes a lot
Yeah,
of sense.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Very cool. Um, so you were talking about how you have like one person monitoring this small fleet, up to three people. Of course, the podcast really focuses on jobs and how technology is impacting jobs.
Sure.
So maybe we can touch on a little bit of the monitoring aspect, but then how do you see your robots, your business impacting, say, farmers? Do the poor people that are bringing out these large rigs, spraying down the monocrops in the future, are they going to be obsolete, or what's the situation from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that if you talk to anyone in the middle of broadacre farming at this point, there is a labor challenge, and
Mhm.
it is the skilled labor on a massive rig, right? You cannot put an idiot on a 50,000 pound rig that's going down the highway
Yeah.
and carrying a load of chemicals, and so there's a lot of things there, and it's hard to recruit for those folks, and it's hard to maintain them. And so there really is a labor problem there. And it is a problem for all farms. Everyone thinks these huge machines and that, but you still have to be on the machine, and you still have to run a very sophisticated system beyond what most people are doing on their desktop computer.
Hmm.
And so I think that that's a real challenge. And so where we come in with that is, some of that goes away. We are as a service. So we're not asking the farmer to run these bots themselves. We run
Right.
it for them. And I think as connectivity improves in that, we'll be able to do a lot more of this remote, right? Starlink or whatever else shows
Yeah.
up out
Yeah.
there. A lot of folks work on that connectivity problem, rural. So I think on the farming perspective, the labor, spray rigs, tractors, we have nothing to do with combines,
Hmm.
but harvesting. But I think that we'll have an impact there. Second place, I think, is the farmer themselves. Um, you know, they spend a lot of time worrying about machinery, spend a lot of time financing machinery, maintaining machinery, having crews that do both, operate the machinery. I think some farms will move towards more and more robotics as a service as time goes by. It'll be cleaner, just like a lot of corporations started moving 20 years ago towards software as a service.
Yep.
And at first it was a slow uptick and then became an avalanche. And I think most companies are running a lot of software as a service at this point. And so I think you'll see this here. What happens with huge farms, I don't know, but that's what I see. And so labor-wise, it gives the farmer too a little more flexibility. If you buy a piece of equipment, that's your piece of equipment. Mm-hmm. You're going to maximize that thing. It's the hammer. Everything looks like a nail. And so our hope is over time, systems like ours will give them more flexibility and more options to do different things with their crops. So we'll see. We'll see how it plays out. We're really, really early.
Yeah.
But that's kind of my hope, and which will change the food system, right? Our capabilities. And you mentioned monocropping. That may not be the case eventually.
Right. Yeah, well, hopefully the weed bots will be part of that solution to move away from the monocrops and towards something a little bit more regenerative.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, that's we're just here to solve a problem. This is not about, I didn't even want to start this company. This company is not about money for any of us involved. It's about growing it and basically solving the problem at hand.
Right. Well, maybe then connected to kind of this future vision, I think there's a bit of a scalability issue here, right? How do you see maybe in 5-10 years? I know that it's quite early for your company, but do you have like a vision as to the scale of Greenfield Robotics? Like, would you be able to have, say, maybe some form of a fleet of robots in most fields across Kansas and in other places in the world where they have these large farming agricultural systems?
Yeah, that is the goal. I mean, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
Of course, we have a plan. I think one of the interesting things about robotics in general is you asked about running at night. And if you look at farming right now, to use a old internet term, it's extremely burstable, meaning high intensity work for short periods, right? Mm-hmm. That's a bandwidth term that people used to talk about. And so if you look at farming, it is you go to plant, you keep getting bigger equipment so you can go like hell and get it done on more and more acres, because you got to spread those costs across those acres because you bought the equipment. And that is all centered around weather events, right? There's some planting windows, there's different windows for things, but it is mostly because of the weather events, and your crop insurance and everything's around this. Well, if you're running all the time, you can run slower and you can spread out your time horizons and spread out your risk. And so I think that robotics as a service is going to be interesting that way. It's more tortoise than hare, maybe, the early stages. And but it's steady. And I think can be a very big change over time. I mean, right now we're just talking about weeding bots going through a field. That's kind of different, but as far as scaling goes, I think that's important. The other thing is when you have smaller machines and you're not asking the farmer to make a massive investment,
right?
You have a better chance of scaling. And if a machine breaks, it's not, and you have a bunch of them, it's not as catastrophic as if you have one or two monster machines and they go down for the day.
Right. So. Yeah, you can still move forward and just pull that one off to the side and do the repairs and whatnot, rather than having to stop absolutely everything, and maybe even slowing down, or maybe I don't know, but I would assume you could even maybe miss planting season or harvesting season if something, as you said, catastrophic would happen with a large machine like that.
That's right. I think for for really big farms that have great service agreements and stuff like that with the current companies out there, they're not going to miss a season, right? I mean, but for a smaller farm like mine, I have an old tractor and part of it is I'm not going to update these things because I don't know what the future holds for it. But the thing is, if my tractor went down in the middle of planting season, now what? Because I don't have those service agreements. I don't have enough acres to spread the cost of having company X come out and fix the thing in the field, which is always much more expensive. I think for small farmers that is a risk. as well.
Okay. Maybe I see the time's winding down here a little bit, but maybe one of the last questions I have for you is, we're talking about size of farmers here as well, right? So have you seen more interest on behalf of the smaller farms than you have on the large farms, or how has that dichotomy happened?
I think it's more about who the farmer is and where they are at in their life cycle as a farmer. I think most of your farmers that are a little bit younger than that are looking at this regenerative ag, and they see the opportunities, and they're practicing it in terms of no-till, and maybe they're doing some cover cropping and stuff like that with government programs, and maybe a little bit of grazing. And they see that. I think if you're a farmer that you're 5 years away from retirement, you're probably, and you have all your equipment paid for, and it's sitting there, you're probably not going to be, you might be interested in what we're doing, but you're probably not going to adopt it realistically.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah, it's always interesting to see because out here in Europe we have the small farm, the small business is quite a large, takes up quite a large proportion of the amount of work being done. So it's always interesting to see the dichotomy, as I said, between Europe and America. But it's interesting to hear that the younger, the kind of more the more innovative farmers out there would be more likely to take something up like this.
Yeah, and I think on a big farm, I'm not nuts. I am a farmer. I'm not going to introduce risk into their operation.
Yeah.
And that's been a key thing for us from day one. I'm like, we go and try to introduce risk into any farm. I don't care, big, small. We can forget about it. Nothing's going to happen. And so I think with the bigger farms, one advantage they have is we can say, just give us a small sliver of your land, and we start with you there, and we prove it.
Right.
Whereas a smaller one, we can't say give us 5 acres. We're not going to fool around with that.
Right.
So, so it is a little more risk from their perspective at that point. But, these early stages, we were like, for example, last year, our confidence is much higher going into this year. But last year, we made sure farmers had sprays ready to go in the background.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Great, Clint. As I said, the time's winding down here. How can people get a hold of you? I'll have the Greenfield Robotics up on the show notes of the episode. But if people want to reach out, maybe see some other pictures of the robots and what you guys are doing, how can people get a hold of you?
I'll tell you, there's two good ways. Just go to the website, which they're going to be unimpressed with the website. So the great irony is all of us used to build tools that built those things, right. But whatever. And then the second thing is they could just connect with me on LinkedIn. Would be a great way to connect as well.
Sure thing.
And great. It's just Clint Brauer. And it's Greenfield Robotics. So
great.
Should be easy to find me.
Great. I'll have both of those up on the show notes for you. Clint, thanks a lot for coming on, sharing a little bit about the weed bots and regenerative agriculture. And it's interesting to have a little bit more of a holistic or kind of a different perspective, a different theme compared to just straight up technology. So thanks for coming on and sharing your information.
Well, thanks for being patient with me and letting us reschedule a few times. My apologies. It's just not the normal way of things for me, but I'm really grateful that you chased me down.
No worries. Glad to have you on.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Thanks, man.
Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast and the conversations here, the best way to do this is to go onto Apple Podcasts and leave a review, as it helps the algorithm to reach out to new listeners and brings the show to them. Also, feel free to check out the website, automatedpodcast.org, where you can find the show notes for each episode, written articles on the themes of the podcast, and a library of resources on the topic of emerging tech and automation. Also, if you want to reach out and leave any feedback or you have any questions about the podcast or any of the conversations, there are general contact links such as email, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. for you there on the website. And finally, for those of you that want more than just an audio conversation, the video recordings are now going to be up on YouTube for the newer conversations, so feel free to check out the videos by searching for Automated Podcast on YouTube, where of course you can like and subscribe if you prefer to support the podcast that way.
The Automated Podcast.